professor and poet, academic and administrator, author and anthologist, teacher and translator, critic and theoretician. P. Raveendran is one of the brightest stars in the intellectual firmament of Kerala. For long years, he presided over the destinies of the School of Letters of Mahatma Gandhi University as its director. The present essay, Genealogies of Indian Literature, was first published in the Economic and Political Weekly in 2006. The Economic and Political Weekly is arguably the most respected, peer-reviewed academic journal published from the subcontinent. It has attracted contributors from not just all parts of the subcontinent, but from many parts of the world as well. Since 1949, the EPW has been published by the Samiksha Trust of Bombay, now known as Mumbai. The essay has a very interesting title, Genealogies of Indian Literature. We shall focus attention on each constituent of the title. Genealogies. Genealogy is descent. Descent from an ancestor. Genealogy is the study of descent from an ancestor. But Raveendran here uses the plural form, genealogies of Indian. India is our country. When I was at school, I used to take the pledge, India is my country and all Indians are my brothers and sisters. India is the region between the Himalayas and Kanyakumari, which was known as Cape Comorin. I don't have to remind you the opening words of the Constitution, of our Constitution. We the people of India. We the people of India, the opening 5 words of the Indian Constitution. The name India is related to the term Indus. Indus is Sindhu. Sindhu is the river which flows in the northwestern part of the subcontinent. In 327 BC, BC 327, Alexander the Great, it's unfashionable today to call him the Great, but I like to call him the Great, invaded India, or at least the northwestern region of India. And he came across the river Sindhu. In the Greek language, there was no sound for the S. The S sound was not there. So, instead of saying Sindhu, they said Indu. Not all sounds are there in all languages. For example, the sound La is not there in Sanskrit. We say Keralam. But in Sanskrit it is actually Kerala. Keralam. Not Kali, but Kali. In ancient Sanskrit, the La sound was not there. That's beside the point, of course. The Greeks, not having the S sound in their language, called the river Sindhu Indus. And they refer to the people living on the eastern bank of the Indus as Indians. That's how the name came to be used. And they refer to the land east of the Indus, east of the Sindhu, as India. So, genealogies of Indian literature. Literature, of course, body of books, body of works, body of written works, which are said to have lasting value. This essay deals with the descent, the study of descent of Indian literature. I would like to point out that Many critics, commentators, researchers, especially those with leftist leanings, those with so called liberal leanings, have a tendency to use the plural form rather than the singular form. Thus, Raveendran here uses genealogies, the term genealogies, not genealogy. What is he trying to suggest? He is trying to suggest that the descent, the line of descent is not simple, it's not a straight line. It's highly complicated. There is more than one genealogy. I am reminded of Nazim Ezekiel's essay, Naipaul's India and Mine. Nazim Ezekiel's essay, Naipaul's India and Mine. What does it suggest? Naipaul has an India and I have another India. So there is more than one India. Similarly, there is A.K. Ramanujan's essay, 300 Ramayanas. 300 Ramayanas. What is Ramanujan trying to suggest? There is more than one Ramayana. And let us not privilege one Ramayana over another Ramayana. There is Valmiki Ramayana, there is Kamban's Ramayana, there is the Jain Ramayana, there is the Thai Ramayana. So the tendency to pluralize Naipaul's India and Mine, 300 Ramayanas. The essay 300 Ramayanas of A.K. Ramanujan is part of the curriculum in DU, in Delhi University, some years back. It came under attack. It became controversial. And it had to be removed from the syllabus. Genealogies of Indian Literature. I'm really surprised that Raveendran does not write literatures. He uses a singular form. In the first word in the title, the first term in the title, he uses the plural form, genealogies. But here in the last word, he uses a singular form. Thank God. Because he sees the body of literature is one unit. I would say, rather tongue-in-cheek, that even here the plural form would have been better, keeping in mind the leftist leanings of the essayist, the liberal leanings of the essayist, and also the leftist leanings and the liberal leanings of the publication which first published this piece, the Economic and Political Weekly. The writer opens the essay by explaining that the terms Indian and literature are not unproblematic. What is Indian? Who is Indian? Can be debated, especially in the context of post-Babri and post-Godra India. The reference here is to the demolition of the Babri Masjid on December the 6th, 1992. The Pran Pratishtha of the Ram Mandir is to be carried out on January the 22nd, 2024, on the very spot where the Babri Masjid stood. The reference is also to the Godra train burning incident, which took place on February the 27th, 2002. In that incident, 59 pilgrims returning from Ayodhya, 59 Karsevaks, were burned to death. And the event triggered the Gujarat riots. Liberal intellectuals, leftist intellectuals feel that these two incidents have resulted in a sharp polarization along socio-religious lines in India. That is why Raveendran here says that the term Indian is a contested term. Similarly, literature is also a contested term in the Indian context. This is because the rise of Dalit writing, the rise of female writing, has been so spectacular in all the languages of India that the very foundations, the very foundational concepts of literature in India, the very foundational concepts of Indian literature in India have come to be questioned and challenged. The point that the writer is trying to make is that we are here dealing with a highly contested terminology when we speak of Indian and literature, Indian literature. Amplifying on this, the writer admits that to speak of a unified Indian literature, to speak of Indian literature as a unit, is a little perverse. This is particularly so because we are living in the global scenario of economic liberalization and cultural recolonization. The supporters of global sensibilities and the supporters of Indian sensibilities are in bitter conflict in the spheres of economy and polity, but not so much in the sphere of literature. This is because there is a presumption that the literary experience is universalist, as exemplified by the concepts developed by the German philosopher, scientist, dramatist, scholar, writer Goethe, and also the figure who is perhaps the most well known literary personage in late 19th century, early 20th century Indian literature, Tagore. Goethe spoke of Welt Literatur and Tagore spoke of Vishwa Sahitya. The idea is that the literature of the world is one, and so they were able to speak of world literature. The writer points out that we are here grappling with the questions of knowledge formation. Knowledge is not a neutral category. One is here reminded of some of the fundamental concepts of Michel Foucault. Foucault established that knowledge and power go hand in hand. What is valid knowledge at a given point of time is decided by the powerful. According to Raveendran, more than 57 years after independence, knowledge in India continues to be tainted by colonial ideology. The writer brings in Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, the Italian thinker, theorist, philosopher, activist. Gramsci pondered over the phenomenon of the working classes supporting fascism in Italy during the decades between the First World War and the Second World War. How come that the working classes supported an ideology which was completely antithetical to the interests of the said classes? Gramsci came up with the concept of hegemony, the culture of a given society, its explanations, its rationalizations, its hierarchy of significance, its questions, its answers. The culture of a given society is largely decided by the segment of the society which dominates it. This culture comes to be accepted by the entire society. The culture of the dominant class becomes the culture of the society as a whole. Gramsci put forward the thesis that material presence is not essential for the exercise of cultural leadership by a dominant group over an underprivileged group. This is the explanation for the fact that even 57 years after independence, knowledge in India continues to be deeply influenced by colonialism and colonialist practices. Imperialism may be dead, but the empire is not dead. Hence, the writer observes that it is imperative for scholars in India to be self-critical about colonialism's impact on their own cultural responses. We have passed through centuries and centuries of imperial and colonial domination. It is imperative for us to rethink concepts like Indianness, Indian sensibility, and Indian literature closely, critically, than ever before, than has been done before, so that we can uncover the complicity of these concepts with the ideology of colonialism. We can uncover how colonialism continues to influence these concepts as much as globalization influences these concepts. It has to be considered that P.P. Raveendran provides his essay with a rather impressive opening. He dissects complex terms like Indian and literature. He mentions historical events like the demolition of the Babri Masjid and the Gaudra incident. He evaluates phenomena such as globalization and liberalization. He mentions Goethe and Tagore, and also concepts like Welt literature and Vishwa Sahitya. He speaks of ancient Sanskrit poetics. He alludes to the famous Foucauldian binary of knowledge and power. He mentions Gramsci. He refers to the 2000 book Empire, published by the Harvard University Press, authored by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, in which the authors try to establish that though imperialism is dead, the empire is not. In this section, P.P. Raveendran evaluates Indian literature in order to demonstrate that it is a highly contested category. For a literature to be a unified whole, for a literature to be a homogeneous unit, a common sensibility, a common literary sensibility has to operate in the context. The question before us is, does such a common literary sensibility operate in the case of Indian literature, in the case of Indian literature? There is tremendous difference between Indian literature and literature in English, between Indian literature and literatures in English. In this context, the writer points out that The influential Chicago University text, The Literatures of India, is titled The Literatures of India and not Indian literature. However, when we go across the individual essays which contribute to the making of the anthology, to the individual essays which constitute the anthology, such a recognition seems to be absent. The recognition that the concept of Indian literature is strikingly different from the concept of literature in India or literatures in India. At the same time, the writer admits that regional literatures in India did not lack self-knowledge, did not lack knowledge of their own identities. However, this does not go very far back in history. In fact, historiography of literature is only as old as the early 19th century. And it is again in the early 19th century that literature came to be seen as a body of self-validating knowledge. The earliest historiographies of literatures in India came out in the 19th century, at the most the early 19th century. And it was in the early 19th century that literature came to be constituted as a self-validating body of knowledge. The term Indian literature was first used not by Indians but by Westerners. And there was a general Sanskrit bias among these Western scholars. It is a fact that they were eager to translate works from Sanskrit into English, into European languages, but not so enthusiastic to translate works from the other Indian languages, especially younger languages like Kannada. The term Indian literature was used for the first time by the German scholar and Indologist August Wilhelm von Schlegel. Schlegel used the term Indian literature synonymously with Sanskrit literature. To him, Indian literature was Sanskrit literature, nothing more, nothing less. Even today, departments of South Asian literature in Western universities are dominated by scholars of Sanskrit, scholars of classical Sanskrit at that. The writer points out that the scholarly attitude has not undergone any change since the 19th century, and that this attitude has absorbed the caste and class bias of the Hindu tradition, which found expression through Sanskrit literature. The section is brought to a close with a quotation from Sheldon Pollock. Sheldon Pollock is an American scholar of Sanskrit and presently professor at Columbia University. Pollock says that the real plurality of South Asian literature was ignored, and so was the dynamic interaction between the various segments of this literature. It has to be pointed out that Sheldon Pollock sees Sanskrit as an instrument of power, as a purveyor of authority, which excludes the many and which facilitates the benefit of the few at the expense of the many. Sheldon Pollock sees Sanskrit as a dead language, and Pollock's approach to Sanskrit has been violently criticized by Indian scholars like Rajiv Malhotra, who, in his book The Battle for Sanskrit, attempts to demonstrate the hollowness of the positions taken by Pollock with regard to Sanskrit and characterizes Pollock as a figure in the international conspiracy to divide Indian society, destabilize the nation, and ultimately cause the disintegration of India, that is Bharat. Indian literature as a category emerged as a result of the efforts of Western Indologists, Western scholars. In fact, the area was almost exclusively dominated by Western scholars up to the first quarter of the 20th century. In the early 20th century, Indian scholars started working in the field, started theorizing about Indian literature, and they picked up the blueprint created by the Western scholars. What was virtually a Western project was now being taken over by Indians. And a large number of Indian scholars started theorizing about Indian literature. Scholars like K.R. Srinivasa Iyengar, Sri Aurobindo, Krishna Kriplani, Uma Shankar Joshi, V.K. Gokak, G.N. Devi, and Ejaz Ahmed. Almost all of them tried to see Indian literature as an expression of Indian culture, as an expression of the unity of India. The exception to this was Ejaz Ahmed, who was able to acknowledge the very impossibility of creating a category which would express the essentials of Indian culture and the cultural unity of India. The Sahitya Academy, whose first president was Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, attempted to propagate the concept of Indian culture being the expression, the concept of Indian literature being the expression of Indian culture. And its slogan was, Indian literature is one, though written in many languages. The writer now poses the question, what are the ideological compulsions? What are the ideological compulsions that rendered the constitution of Indian literature imperative in the 19th century? Indian literature as a category came to be constituted in the 19th century, continues to be looked upon as a category even today. What are the ideological underpinnings of this category? What are the ideological factors that shaped this theoretical category? The writer mentions quite a few. Colonialist expansion, capitalist expansion, nationalist awakening, social reform movements, freedom struggle, independence, increasing modernization of society, expanding English studies program, expanding print culture, democratization of the reading public, and in the sphere of literature, an overall consolidation of Western ideology and aesthetic. The writer admits that these are quite a few compulsions indeed. Hence, he does not intend to consider all of them. He does not intend to analyze and evaluate all the compulsions. Instead, he decides to examine three issues which are intricately related to the question of Indian literature and see how they have interacted with one another to produce the kind of scholarship associated with the category of Indian literature. I feel tempted here to work out a comparison between this position taken by the writer and the principles of New Historicism. New Historicism believes that literature does not exist in a vacuum. Every literature is the product of its times, and there is no point in studying the literary text alone. New historicists refuse to say that literature is the foreground and the other factors are the background. According to them, all factors interact on the same plane. This is almost what P.P. Raveendran is saying here. In order to understand Indian literature as a category, we have to understand the ideological compulsions that played a significant role in shaping it. And these compulsions include colonialist expansion, capitalist expansion, social reform movement, freedom struggle, independence, rise of English studies, democratization of print culture, and so on and so forth. The writer concedes that a lot of work has been done on the writings of the European Indologists, particularly so after the publication in 1978 of Orientalism by Edward Said. Edward Said was an American scholar, theorist, teacher, and activist of Palestinian origin. The basic thesis of Orientalism, Edward Said's book, is that Western discourse manufactured the Orient in a particular manner so that it becomes the contrasting binary of the Occident. There is no doubt that the Indologists, the European Indologists, like William Jones, like Max Muller, did tremendous work. And if they had not stepped in, many ancient classics would have been lost or might have been lost to posterity. However, it is not possible to accept the work of the European Indologists blindly. For example, all of them quite systematically organize Indian history into ancient India or Hindu India, predominantly Hindu India, medieval India or Muslim dominated India, and modern India or British India. All of them do it in a systematic manner that it cannot be a kind of oversight. Edward Said's Orientalism is problematic in its theory and its methodology. In fact, H.S. Ahmed called it a deeply flawed book. For example, during the centuries of colonialist expansion, there was intense rivalry among the colonial powers. And this rivalry, this friction, must have cast its shadow on Orientalism. But Edward Said does not have anything to say on the matter. In fact, he seems to see the colonialist enterprise almost as a unified, homogeneous enterprise, and not as an enterprise carried out by rival powers locked in intense conflict with one another. The Orientalists fought for the cause of Sanskrit and Persian. The Anglicists supported the cause of English. The latter wanted Sanskrit and Persian to be replaced by English as the language of education, as the language of the government, as the lingua franca of the land. But the writer here says that the real conflict was not between the Orientalists and the Anglicists, because though they were seemingly opposed to each other in the matter explained here, they were both indifferent to the regional languages. The real conflict, according to the writer, was between the Orientalists and the Anglicists on the one hand, and the regional languages and the regional cultures on the other. Both the Orientalists and the Anglicists saw nothing of value in the regional languages and the regional cultures. In the battle between the Orientalists and the Anglicists, of course, the Anglicists won with the coming out of the infamous minute of T.B. Macaulay. Macaulay's minute declared that the aim of education would be the creation of a class of Indians who could be depended upon by the British. As Macaulay vehemently put it, Indian in blood and colour, but English in taste and opinion. Coming to Indian literature in English, P.P. Raveendran points out that all early Indian writers in English, suffered a kind of identity crisis on the linguistic plane. He gives two very appropriate examples. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee wrote the first novel in Indian writing in English. Michael Madhusudan Dutt can be looked upon as the first accomplished Indian poet in English. Both Bankim Chandra Chatterjee and Michael Madhusudan Dutt abandoned the English language as they grew older and more mature and started writing in their mother tongue, Bengali, and made a mark for themselves as writers, as authors in Bengali. Discussing the clash between the Orientalists and the Anglicists, P.P. Raveendran explains that the real conflict was not between the champions of Sanskrit and the champions of English, but between the Orientalists and the Anglicists on the one hand, and the regional, local cultures on the other. Sanskrit was championed because of its past glories. English was championed because of its present powers. Both the champions of Sanskrit and the champions of English had nothing but contempt for the regional languages and the local cultures. The irony here is that P.P. Raveendran himself writes in English here. This point would have been more appropriately made had it been expressed not in English but in a regional language. Perhaps then the writer would have been more true to himself. Coming to the language question, the writer says that in the 1950s and 1960s, a much debated question was the feasibility of the English language as a creative medium for Indians. Scholars like Buddhadev Bose and P. Lal worked out theoretical formulations but could not arrive at a convincing answer. What could not be achieved by scholars like Buddhadev Bose and P. Lal in the 1950s and the 1960s was achieved by the generation of writers of Salman Rushdie. Salman Rushdie is, of course, arguably the greatest English language writer of the second half of the 20th century. He is known for his works like Midnight Children and Satanic Verses, and of course, he won several literary awards, including the Booker Prize. P.P. Raveendran's point is that what could not be proved on a plane of theory by scholars like Buddhadev Bose and P. Lal, despite their best efforts, has been proved on a plane of praxis by the writers of Salman Rushdie's generation. It is possible for a person to be a creative genius in an alien language, as demonstrated by these writers. It was the politics of the language question that Bankim Chandra Chatterjee and Michael Madhusudan Dutt were indirectly concerned with when they decided to reject the English language as their medium of creative expression in the 19th century. But the, the achievements of Salman Rushdie and his generation has posed a question mark over this politics of language. O.V. Vijayan, who brought about a dramatic change in the sensibility of Malayalam literature with his groundbreaking 1969 novel Khasakinte Itihasam, used to say that one knows a region by its characteristic fauna. The fish that one gets in Chennai is different from the fish that one gets in Mumbai or Tunis or Manchester for that matter. Language is a system of metaphors. Language is certainly ideological. The real Indian literature is written in the regional languages. If that is so, Indian literature as a concept is nothing more than a chimera. Indian literature is a literature written in different Indian languages. That is what we will have to say. The real specimens of Indian literature are found in the regional languages. The concept of Indian literature in general is something which we can hope for, but also something which is illusory. It is nothing but a chimera. To the 19th century Orientalists, Indian literature meant Sanskrit literature. To the present day Western critics, at least some of them, Indian literature means Indian English literature. It appears that beyond these two, Sanskrit literature and Indian English literature, there is no such thing as Indian literature. It is interesting to note that the writer brings in Salman Rushdie and O.V. Vijayan in the same section. Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children is looked upon as the finest English novel, greatest English novel of the second half of the 20th century. And it effected a tectonic shift in literature in English. Something very similar can be said of Kasakinda Itihasam of O.V. Vijayan, arguably the greatest Malayalam novel of the second half of the 20th century, which effected a tectonic shift in Malayalam literature. We now come to the last section of the essay, titled The Politics of Writing. Here the writer makes several important points. First of all, P.P. Raveendran says that it may not be possible to justify theoretically or support using a cohesive methodology the concept of Indian literature as an ontologically related body of knowledge with a shared discursive history. The only way to do this is by invoking the ideology of nationalism, the sense of cultural identity, the sense of cultural unity of India. And this precisely was what was done by the nationalists during the last phase of the colonial rule in India. In the 20th century, this concept of Indian literature as a unified ontological entity was widely propagated, and the writer cites the example of the poet Subramanya Bharati, the Tamil poet Bharati, who said that the Indian nation speaks 18 languages, though her chintana, thinking, is one. Very similar is the motto of the Sahitya Academy. It can even be said that the Indologists of the 19th century were also operating within a very similar or almost identical conceptual framework. However crude and vague the framework might have been at that point of time, the nationalists of the 20th century carried forward the efforts taken by the Indologists of the 19th century. In the 19th century, Orientalists vied with each other for cultural capital by making claims on folk and literary traditions to invent a glorious past for the culture of India that they held dear. The writer explains that the India that emerges as a divided landmass of divided interests in the present was connected by a common and glorious past. Indian literature then is both a product of this constructed past and an active agent in the construction of that past. Let me try to amplify on what the writer says. The first point is that it is difficult, almost impossible to justify theoretically the existence of Indian literature as an ontological entity with a discursive past. The only thing that can be done in order to justify this ontological entity with a discursive past is to invoke the support of nationalism. This is precisely what the early 20th century nationalists did, and the Orientalists, the Indologists before them did. Indian literature is thus simultaneously a product of a past, of a glorious past. But the problem is that it's a constructed past, and also an active agent in the construction of that past, because while constructing the glory of India's past, the Orientalists the Indologists as well as the nationalists, used literature as an element. Why is India's past glorious? For a number of reasons, and one of the reasons is that it has a great literature. One of the reasons is that ancient Sanskrit literature is unique, has no parallels anywhere in the world, is remarkable. The writer now juxtaposes modernity and tradition. He says modernity is a mindset rather than a physical condition. It is a mindset which emerges from a physical condition. There is no doubt that modernity has its own share of contradictions, but it welcomes change, growth, progress. It is an experience which unifies humanity, which cuts across distinctions of all kinds, cuts across distinctions of class, caste, race, gender, language, nationality. As has already been said, it is not free from contradictions. The writer now quotes the American Marxist philosopher Marshall Berman, who gives a very balanced picture of modernity. Berman sees modernity as a body of experience that places us in an environment that promises adventure, power, joy, growth, transformation, and also threatens to destroy everything that we have. In opposition to modernity, tradition is often painted as the obverse of what is seen as the positive features of modernity. Tradition epitomizes ignorance, changelessness, narrow mindedness, lack of power. Traditional India was very much in possession of all these vices according to British accounts. And the British saw it as their historical responsibility to change this tradition. It was in this background that the great reform project, the grand reform project of the colonialist was born. The writer points out that Indian scholars of the 19th century and the 20th century, whether they were Orientalists or Anglicists, reformists or nationalists, could not have been unaffected by this project and its accompanying discourse. The Nehruvian nationalist slogan, India's unity lies in its diversity, became the credo of Indian modernity. Its parallel axiom in literature is Indian literature is one, though written in many languages. The genealogy of Indian literature includes myths, legends, stories, and even patterns of narration. And these have bound together Indian literature over the centuries. Scholars like Ayappa Panikar would argue that there are specific patterns of narration which are Indian in nature, and these patterns have given Indian literature its identity. The myths, stories, legends, patterns of narration appear and reappear in Indian literature from time immemorial. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the stories of the Panchatantra, the Tamil classics Silappatikaram and Manimekalai are all part of the genealogy of Indian literature. P. Raveendran now quotes Uma Shankar Joshi, the Gujarati poet, prose writer, scholar, editor, and professor. He points out that Uma Shankar Joshi observes that imaginative literature has accrued not only to the people of India but also to the peoples of far off lands, making the idea of Indian literature relevant from the point of view of the foreign appropriators even in those early days. The writer says that by focusing on the foreign appropriators, Joshi is able to also focus attention on Indian literature as a single entity. Indian literature is a theoretical category in order to signify the distinctiveness of Indian literature in relation to the literature of the rest of the world. The contrast is between Indian literature and non-Indian literature, between Indian literature and the perspective of the non-Indian reader. This is, of course, related to India's status as a nation in the political map of the world. The writer says that a nation should have an army, a nation should have a currency, it should also have a literature. But the problem is that it is not possible to present Indian literature as the expression of an essential Indian spirit or of a commonly shared sensibility, because the nation in question is stable only on the map of the world. Its borders keep changing from writer to writer, from reader to reader, from subject to subject, when we evaluate the nation on the plane of literature. In order to amplify on this, the writer brings to our attention the fact that the images of India appearing in the works of the various Indian writers like Sadat Hussain Manto, Mahasweta Devi, Vaikam Muhammad Bashir, U.R. Anandamurthy, Shashi Tharoor vary from one another. It is not possible to speak of an essential Indian spirit running through the works of these writers who share the same nationality and perhaps also belong to the same historical period. The writer wraps up the essay by observing that it is possible to twist somewhat the spirit of the Sahitya Academy motto regarding the oneness of Indian literature and say that Indian writers are divided by the same literature. We have just completed reading an essay of sweeping scholarship profound insight, and ruthless logic. The style of writing adopted by the writer is perfectly appropriate to the context. The style is exact, precise, and scientific. The writer refuses to be carried away by feeling, passion, or emotion. He refuses to take extreme positions. In fact, P.P. Raveendran proves himself to be a past master of the balancing act. He is aware that the truth is always grey. He is not unwilling to admit that any position will have its share of contradictions. On the whole, the essay is an extremely impressive piece of writing.